The story begins with our main character, Keith Brandon, a highly gifted individual who excelled in his studies and was recognized as the youngest sage in history. He joined one of the prestigious orders of knights, but was surprisingly demobilized after a little over a year. Keith admits that he was not a good team player, a view shared by his counterpart, Alan Scowland, the first prince. Nevertheless, Alan praises Keith for his achievements over the past year, even though he had expected difficulties earlier on. Alan assures Keith that he has nothing to worry about and promises to resolve his conflict with the 11th Knight. The story then switches to a flashback in which the commander of the 11th Knight, Count Benoit, yells at Keith for once again failing to follow his strategy. Keith explains that he has adapted to the changed circumstances, but Count Benoit remains furious and is fed up with Keith's excuses. Count Benoit never listens to Keith and always acts like he's in charge, which infuriates Keith even more. Keith, with arrogance, questions what the problem is since they didn't suffer any casualties and successfully defeated all the monsters. However, the Count is informed that this is not just about the results. It's about him defying his orders and putting their unity at risk. The Count, speaking to him in a disrespectful manner, asks if he needs a reminder that he is the current head of the Barrier family, who has led them to many victories in the human-monster war. Keith simply replies that he was speaking to him normally, and that it was the predecessor, Count Eric Barrier, who led them to those victories, not him. This enrages the Count, who tries to attack Keith with his sword, but Keith easily dodges the attack and gets behind him. He tells the Count that the 11th Knight Order would be better off if he were strong enough to defeat him, and he punches the commander in the face. Back in the present, Alan is amazed and still can't believe that Keith actually punched a noble, even though he is already 20 and should know better. He asks Alan if there is any chance they can replace the Count with someone else, because as long as he is in command, the order will suffer unnecessarily. Alan explains to him that it would be difficult to accomplish that with the current circumstances. The council had a tight grip on the Knight Orders, so he couldn't act alone, even though he wanted to address the issue. Keith, understanding his frustration, asks about demobilization, thinking he would just be sent back to the battlefield. Alan explains that the Noble Council was involved and publicly called him out, forbidding him from joining any other Knight Order. Keith wonders if this will cause problems, but Alan assures him that he had already anticipated trouble from him. Besides, the 11th Knight Order had the lowest rank, so reassigning a troublemaker like him to a higher-ranked order would set a bad example. Keith asks if he should go back to doing research, but Alan believes he is capable of more. However, even if he were sent to the front lines alone, Alan doubts he would achieve the desired results. Currently, none of the Knight Orders had the power to reclaim his birthplace, which was now under the influence of monsters. Because of this, he thought that they might need a significant change. In fact, Celine had been pleading with him to let her have Keith for some time now. Celine, the head chairman at the Royal Knight Academy, wanted him to become a teacher and mentor the next generation of knights. Keith panicked and explained that he couldn't be a teacher since most of his skills were self-taught. However, Alan assured him that everything had already been decided, and he would have to start working as a teacher at the Knight Academy in just 2 days. Keith was a bit annoyed that everything was decided without his input. On the other hand, Alan continued to tease him and asked if he wasn't excited to revisit their old school. 2 days later, Keith arrived at the Royal Knight Academy, a prestigious institution that trained young knights to battle monsters in the future. Located in the royal capital, it was the most esteemed Knight Academy, reserved only for the elite. Keith reminisced about graduating from this place at the young age of 13. However, he decided to first visit Celine in the board chairman's room. There, he met up with Celine, who held the title of Sage and served as the chairman of the board at the Royal Knight Academy. Celine was also a year above Keith and Alan. She was thrilled to see him, feeling like they were kids again. However, she quickly got down to business and informed him about his work. The class he would be in charge of was Class 1A, still freshman, and not molded into anything yet. She believed he would have an easier time with them, She rambled on about how he would also have to conduct lectures on special topics. Since she kept the number of students low, he would still have plenty of free time. Additionally, he could use their research facility during his free time. The mention of the research facility caught his attention, and he expressed concern if it was really okay. Celine assured him that it was, as she believed his research would increase the overall survival rate of all knights. She also offered to get anything he needed for the research lab, as long as it was within her power. He thought it was a great offer. However, she instructed him to stop calling her Cell because she was now the board chairman, and he was a teacher. She didn't mind if he did it when they were alone, but she wanted to make sure he didn't do it in front of others. He gets it, and realizes that it was kind of strange to still use that old nickname now that he's 20 years old. Celine adds that he also received a letter from Prince Alan, who wanted him to maintain his status as a secret sage. He agrees because if the students found out that a sage was demoted, it would cause a lot of commotion. Lastly, she informs him that he can find all the details about the curriculum in the documents and asks if he has any questions. There was one thing bothering him, so he asks her why she wanted him to be a teacher here. In response, Celine asks if he knew about the disproportionate number of deaths among the knights. Keith replies, asking if she means how most of the deaths are of young knights who have only been serving for about 3 years. She confirms and explains that it has become a trend to view knights as expendable pawns, especially in lower-ranked knight orders, where incompetent commanders are more likely to treat their knights this way. In the eyes of the public, knights and monsters are seen as evenly matched, but Celine believes they are currently in a dire situation. Keith agreed that despite being evenly matched, the human territory was still shrinking year by year. It was becoming increasingly clear that they lacked the means to fight against the monsters. All they could do at the moment was delay the inevitable and painful destruction of their country. This unfortunate reality was why Celine wanted him to train the students. She and Prince Alan had tried to avoid resorting to this, but they couldn't handle it alone anymore. Keith admitted that it was true. He remembered how the skill level of the graduates had improved since Cell became the board chairman of the Royal Knight Academy. However, the training period for new knights had been shortened, resulting in an increase in casualties. Alan had also tried to influence things behind the scenes, but it would take time to see the results. Unfortunately, the monsters weren't patient enough to wait for them. Celine started to cry and asked Keith for help with the students. She didn't want to hear any more reports of fresh graduates dying. Keith told her that he didn't have any experience training people and wasn't sure if he would be good at it. He couldn't promise to be of great help right now. However, the destination he desired to reach had remained unchanged since that day. Unfortunately, he couldn't make the entire journey on his own. Nevertheless, driven by his own selfish ambitions, he made a promise to become a good teacher. Celine expressed her gratitude and utilized her rare and challenging magical skill called Spatial Leap to almost instantly embrace him. That's how overjoyed she was. Later, he arrived outside the classroom and overheard students discussing him. They had heard rumors that he had been fired from a prestigious organization called the Knight Order. He had anticipated such gossip, but the nature of the rumors was particularly unpleasant. He hoped that everything would turn out fine. Just then, the bell rang, signaling the start of his class. He entered the classroom, fully prepared for the task at hand. As soon as he stepped into the room, the entire class fell silent. He introduced himself as the class instructor and expressed his desire to foster a positive relationship with his students. Suddenly, a student named Graham, who possessed the attribute of fire and hailed from a lower-ranking noble family, raised his hand to ask a question. Graham had performed above average in the entrance exam. He inquired whether it was true that the teacher had become an instructor after being dismissed from the Knight Order. Keith couldn't quite decipher whether Graham was fearless or simply unaware. However, he still tells him that it's true he spent a year on the front lines. But the order didn't feel right to him, so he was discharged and then assigned here to teach the next generation of knights. The students were shocked by how straightforward he was in his answer, which was a normal reaction because being laid off was considered a great dishonor for Knight's public image. So, any normal person would naturally try to hide it. But Keith didn't see the need to conceal the fact. Then, another student named Elistera, who had the attributes of wind and water and was the fourth daughter of Duke Grantis, raised her hand and wanted to ask something. She joined this academy to become a top-ranking knight, so she questioned him if he thought she could achieve that goal by learning from a discharged teacher. Keith simply responded that it all depended on her. He stated that if the capabilities of their homeroom teacher somehow affected their academic success, then maybe the problem lied with them. The academy had excellent research facilities that were all at their disposal, and the library was filled with all sorts of books. So they have the perfect environment to develop and improve their skills as long as they actually want to. But Elistera gets really angry and tells him that he's being irresponsible by trying to escape reality. However, he bluntly tells her that if she doesn't like his class, she's free to do her own thing. He also assures her that he won't mark her absent, so she doesn't have to worry about her credits. She slams the desk and accuses him of trying to downplay his lack of ability and shifting the responsibility onto the students. Keith asks if she's implying that he's not worthy enough and tells him to just shut up because he doesn't know what he's talking about. Elistera responds by saying that she wouldn't go as far as saying those exact words, but that was the general idea. He remembers that she's the daughter of Duke Gress, the commander of the First Knight Order, the most powerful and respected order of all. Even though he knew she would be as proud as her dad and was expecting a confrontation, he didn't think she would take it this far. Still, he was impressed because she seemed promising as the top student of the school year. She may not be as strong as Celine and Alan used to be, but that wasn't a big deal. What mattered more was her will, her determination to become an excellent knight. He was intrigued to see how determined she was, wondering how far her willpower would take her. He acknowledges that he often shares the same thoughts when witnessing arrogant individuals abusing their power. The expression on his face leaves everyone speechless, but their homeroom session comes to an end as the bell rings. Practical training is up next, giving him the perfect opportunity to shake things up. Since many of them doubted his practical skills, he decides to announce a mock battle with him as their opponent. One student points out that they have no chance against a former knight, but Keith challenges them to come at him all at once, all 30 of them. A student gets angry, feeling underestimated, while Elistera reminds him that the top 3 students from the Royal Knight Academy are equivalent to fully fledged knights. They refuse to believe they will lose to him. Keith agrees, acknowledging that in a battle of magic, strength lies in numbers. However, he confidently states that they will just have to wait and see what happens. He exits the room and tells everyone to get ready, which starts to irritate Elistera because he was clearly mocking them. Later, at the training grounds, everyone gathers around when suddenly a student named Fairy approaches him and questions if he really wants to fight in those clothes. He remembers that she is a commoner, and her entrance exam score was below average. He assures her that he will be fine, but then Elistera starts yelling at him, accusing him of humiliating them on purpose. He tries to explain that it wasn't his intention and he doesn't need any special preparations, which only angers her more. She gathers everyone and glares at Fairy, who is still talking to Keith. Fairy quickly rushes to Elistera's side. He notices that there are no barriers between the nobles and commoners in this class, and Elistera is the reason behind this equality. His documents didn't mention this information, but despite his questionable methods, he decides to use this opportunity to observe the students' personalities before starting the test. He warns them all that since it's a mock battle, any physical damage they receive will only deplete their mana. In other words, they won't get hurt. However, if they deplete too much mana, they will pass out. And if that happens, they'll have to skip the rest of their classes for the day. So he advises them not to go overboard. But then, one student named Bellamy, who has the Earth attribute and comes from a noble background, argues that there's only one teacher, so it wouldn't come to that. Without wasting any more time, Keith responds that it's their choice whether to listen to his advice or not. And without any further delay, he initiates the mock battle. To everyone's surprise, all the students attack him with their magic spells, but Keith effortlessly cancels out their attacks, leaving everyone in awe. They speculate if it's space magic, as it doesn't seem to belong to any of the main attributes. However, they find it hard to believe that a knight who is fired within a year could possess such a high-tier ability. Elistera steps in to calm everyone down and reminds them to stay focused on their opponents. Keith asks if their entire strategy is to take him down in one shot, to which she replies that it's not. He then explains that real battles can be unpredictable, and they can't always rely on their plans. He clenches his fist and utilizes one of his magical abilities, causing Elistera to realize that she is unable to move or speak. He has taken away her ability to move. He pulls her towards him and asks the other students how they plan to proceed now that their commander has been taken hostage. One student shouts that he is a coward and shouldn't call himself a teacher. However, Kay points out that monsters often do this kind of thing on the battlefield, and questions whether they would consider them cowardly as well. He suggests that they treat this situation as a real battle, where he is the monster, and he has captured one of their precious comrades. He asks them once again what their next move will be. Will they attempt to rescue her, risking more casualties, or will they play it safe and attack the monster together with their friend? The students are left deep in thought. But then, Elistera declares that if she would only drag everyone down, she would choose death instead. She begins casting a spell, surprising Keith with her incredible magical output. He wonders if it's a spell that combines both water and wind attributes. Normally, humans have a limit to how much mana they can use at once, but Elistera has clearly surpassed that barrier. She breaks free from his grasp and launches a powerful magic spell towards him. He was amazed to witness the true power of Elistera Grantis, who had already transformed into a formidable beast. He was curious to see how much further she could push herself. The spell struck him directly, leaving the students in awe of her abilities. They debated whether she had gone too far, but also believed that it was his own fault for underestimating them in the first place. Ballista reflected on the fact that it was her strongest spell, yet it didn't seem to have any effect on him. Despite this, everyone was astonished. He admitted to her that he had thought he was doing a good job restraining her movements, but she still managed to attack him. This demonstrated the unpredictability of real battles. A student questioned how he remained unharmed after being hit by such a spell. Keith explained that understanding the opponent's strength and devising a suitable strategy was a fundamental aspect of combat. In response to their question, he encouraged them to try and figure it out themselves, suggesting that they might be able to defeat him. Suddenly, Elistera threw 3 knives at him, but they bounced off harmlessly just before reaching him. She finally gets it, and tells everyone that he was a defensive magician who specialized in magic barriers. She also realizes that her own barrier was likely designed to protect only him. He's impressed that she saw through his barrier so quickly, and thinks to himself that she has a talent for magic and an unbreakable will. Not only that, but she also has great observation and analytical skills. With those qualities alone, she's guaranteed to have a successful future as a knight. However, she has one more trick up her sleeve. She quickly instructs the close combat fighters to prepare their weapons and step forward, while the rest should stand behind and attack from a distance. Her other talent is being a commander. The battle begins and they all attack him, but he effortlessly dodges their attacks. Suddenly he realizes that Elistera is nowhere to be found. He looks around and sees that she's once again charging up a powerful spell that requires a lot of mana. He can't allow her to cast it, so he instantly disappears and reappears right behind her. He knocks her down to prevent her from overexerting herself. The other students keep attacking him, but he effortlessly blocks all of their attacks. He thinks to himself that these students are really talented, and their hard work and cell reforms was not in vain. The battle continues for a while, and then the scene changes to the sick bay. Elistera finally wakes up and finds herself under the care of Acris, the expert in healing magic and the nurse in charge of the academy's sick bay. Acris is also a year junior to Alan and Keith. Elistera explains that she passed out during a mock battle because she used up too much of her mana. She starts thinking about what happened earlier when the professor was surrounded by the others, but somehow disappeared. It wasn't like Principal Selene's space magic which teleports her. Instead, he seemed to have moved in a straight line. Elistera wonders if it was wind magic or physical enhancement. But regardless, the most important question is how many types of magic can he actually use? He was using it at such a high level. Akris then asks Elistera if she's curious about the results of the battle. She replies that she already knows they didn't stand a chance against him. Akris chuckles and says that Keith said the same thing. Elistera was indeed a promising student. She inquires if he had said the same thing, and Akris confirms that he introduced himself upon arrival. However, Elistera still wonders about his true nature. The nurse asks if he had made such a strong impression on her, to which she responds with a nod. She used to believe her father was the strongest, but the professor's power surpassed his by miles. Akris is left deep in thought, as her father was the renowned commander of the First Night Order. For him to acknowledge Keith's superiority must have been quite a shock. It was only his first day, yet he was already making a significant impact. Akris then tells Elistera that it must be an incredible opportunity for her to train with such a formidable individual. Considering her talent, she is certain to become equally amazing in the future. Elistera briefly questions her own talent, but she recalls her father's advice to never let humility hinder her growth. The Grantis family values hard work and despises laziness, so she feels motivated to seize this chance to become stronger. She attempts to get up from the bed, but suddenly feels dizzy. Akris stops her, cautioning that she should not move just yet, as she is likely still experiencing the effects of mana overuse. So, she really needs to take a break until those things are completely gone. Meanwhile, on a certain night order, Count was still furious and couldn't believe that Keith got off with such a light punishment. All they did was ban him from joining the Night Order. Cut to a flashback during a meeting where they discussed that even though he was part of the 11th Order, technically he wasn't in a lower position than the Count. Plus, he was a sage and all sage-related matters were handled by the royal family. Considering his close relationship with Prince Alan, who does a lot of work for the king, they told the Count not to expect anything more than having Keith removed from his order. Now because of Keith, the other knights were also causing trouble. So the Count decides to show him who's in charge. The scene then switches back to Class 1A, where Keith tells everyone that if they were to become knights right now, they would all be pretty much dead within a year. The students were left speechless. However, Ymir, the third best student in terms of grades, asks him if that isn't a bit of an exaggeration. Keith responds that even though it may seem like one, the fact that their best student, Elistera, wasn't there and was resting in the sick bay says otherwise. It's clear that they just weren't good enough. In order to survive, they'll have to dedicate the next 3 years to intense studying and training. Only then will they have the power to defeat real monsters. The teacher also reminds them that if they don't see the value in attending his classes, they don't have to. As long as they can achieve good results, they can choose any training method they prefer, and he won't interfere. One student questioned if the teacher is implying that his own lessons aren't enough for them, but he clarifies that's not what he meant. He uses Lina Leanbill as an example, mentioning that her family has produced exceptional scouts for generations. Since being a scout requires specialized skills and magic, it wouldn't make sense for Lina to follow the same curriculum as the others. Lina asks if he means they should choose the most effective method to achieve their goals, and he agrees. He also mentions that he won't grade them based on effort, but rather on their magic abilities and strength. In other words, it's all about the results. Firstly, the amount of effort they had to put in only showed how much they lacked ability. It wasn't something they needed to prove to others, and definitely not something to be proud of. He also mentioned that it would be too cruel to just leave them to figure things out on their own without any guidance. So, he decided to start by identifying their strengths and weaknesses, and giving them tips on how to strengthen their strengths and overcome their weaknesses. One student, Salika, asked how he could already know their strengths and weaknesses since he just transferred here today. He explained that he had gone through all of their academic results from the past month and observed their abilities during the mock battle, so he had a good enough understanding. The students were a bit creeped out, but they didn't think he was a bad guy. Later in the afternoon, Elistera left the sick bay and the first thing she needed to do was find her teacher, Keith. She couldn't find his name on the information board or in the teacher's lounge, so she wondered if they missed each other. Suddenly, Keith appeared behind her and asked if she was looking for him. She got startled and told him not to sneak up on people like that. However, he inquires about her well-being, and she promptly apologizes for causing him so much trouble. Nevertheless, he reassures her that it was not a big deal. She then expresses her desire to have a conversation with him. He leads her to his research room, but on the way, she asks him where his research room is located since she couldn't find his name on the information board. In response, he explains that he recently arrived, so it might take some time for the board to be updated. As for his room, it is incredibly spacious, leaving her in awe. She takes a seat and begins by apologizing to him for her assumption earlier in the morning when she heard that he was fired from a knight's order after only a year. She selfishly believed that he failed due to lack of effort. However, his strength displayed during the mock battle clearly showed that he had put in a tremendous amount of effort. She realizes that she criticized him for something that wasn't even true, and she sincerely apologizes for that. Keith simply responds with an "all right," surprising Elistera, who expected him to scold her. He explains that he is not petty enough to do that. However, there is one thing he wants to scold her about, and that is regarding her 2-attribute spell. Right now, the Alvari spell was overwhelming for her. If she continued to ignore it and use it, there would be serious consequences for her body. He couldn't understand why she was in such a rush, but he advised her to avoid using the spell if possible. However, he mentioned that if she insisted on using it, she would need to focus on improving her mana efficiency through basic training and increasing her mana capacity. Elistera was confused and suggested that he could have simply told her to stop using it altogether. Keith explained that ultimately the decision was up to her, but she would have to take full responsibility for her choices. Elistera was left speechless, and she asked Keith for his opinion on the students. He used to be a knight, but now he was a teacher, so she wondered if teaching was something he was truly passionate about. Keith thought to himself that Elistera seemed anxious, as she worried about her potential to become an excellent knight. However, he couldn't comprehend why she was in such a rush to improve and why she pushed herself so hard. With her immense talent, she shouldn't have anything to worry about. He gazes at her and then confesses that he didn't believe having passion for something was particularly important. Passion or not, it didn't matter, as long as the results were good. Nevertheless, as their teacher, he had set an ambitious goal for himself: to make them strong enough to survive the nights. Elistera questions if she can trust him to achieve that goal, but he simply states that it's a decision only she can make. She leaves the room, lost in deep thoughts as she continues on her way. The next day their class begins, and Keith informs them that for the first period, they will be going through the fundamentals of magic. He notices that every student is present, and thinks to himself that despite everything he had said, they were all still there. He had expected at least a few to be absent, but it seems like they are all quite serious. A student asks which page in the textbook they should turn to, and he tells them that they won't be using their textbooks in his lessons. They can simply put them away and not bother bringing them to class. A girl approached him, questioning if there was an issue with the books. He responded by explaining that the content in their textbooks often didn't align with the latest research findings. While this might be acceptable for most practical users, he believed it would be more effective for him to personally teach them everything from scratch. This left the students feeling confused. In a flashback, it was revealed that Celine had advised him against using the textbooks due to their outdated nature. She believed that since he was one of the best in the field of magic research, it would be fine. He asked her if it would truly be all right, considering his unique views. However, Celine assured him that it was thanks to those unique views that he had come up with numerous novel theories and became a sage. He knew what he was doing, so he should have more confidence in himself. Returning to the present, he began the class by starting with the very basics. He explained that when casting spells, they utilized something called mana, which naturally existed in the atmosphere. As it passed through their mana receptors, it accumulated in their bodies. However, According to the latest research, what was present in the atmosphere was referred to as mana essence. Mana essence is completely distinct from the mana within their bodies. It was proven that mana essence cannot be transformed into magic using a magic sequence. In the past, there was an unsuccessful attempt in this country to use a large device to cast powerful magic, as they were unable to convert mana essence into mana. A student then asks how magic items function, to which Keith explains that magic items work because the user's mana reacts with the magic sequence inscribed on them. Most magic items are used for basic purposes that don't require much mana, so there's no need to activate them using mana essence. Keith further explains that mana essence automatically converts into mana once it enters the body, so there's usually no need to worry about the difference. He then observes that the students are all quite interested, and proceeds to discuss the conversion process. When mana essence enters an individual's body, the resulting mana can have different attributes depending on the person. The total number of attributes is still unknown, but the main ones are fire, wind, water, and earth. These attributes also influence the type of magic that individuals are most skilled in. The attribute of their mana is determined by their mana receptors and is often inherited genetically. That's why some people might have heard about families where everyone practiced the same type of magic. After a long day, only the homeroom was left, and everyone was exhausted. Keith came back just in time for their homeroom, but before that he wanted to discuss something. He asked them about their goals, starting with Raoul. Raoul said his goal was to become an excellent knight. Keith understood and mentioned that most of them probably had vague goals like Raoul's. However, vague goals weren't very motivating. What they really needed were concrete goals that they could start working towards. Keith then brought up the upcoming competition next month. Elistera asked if he meant the annual tournament, where all the classes in the academy battled each other to see who was the strongest. Keith confirmed and mentioned that the winners in previous years had all been from the third year. The first years mostly participated in the tournament to recognize the difference in ability between them and the seniors, but this time, Keith believed they could use this opportunity to set a common goal for all of Class 1A. 1 week later, since Keith was assigned to this academy, they would start working towards that goal. Keith sat in the teacher's lounge, contemplating the new direction he should take with his lessons. The students had been quick to grasp the material and showed great interest in it. Suddenly, Balak, the squad leader from the Third Night Order, entered the room. He commented on how tough it must have been for him to be assigned here out of nowhere. Keith admitted that it was indeed unexpected, but it hadn't been particularly difficult. Balak was pleased to see that teachers nowadays were truly competent, unlike when he was studying to become a knight. Back then, the teachers lacked motivation and were simply individuals who couldn't join the Night Order. Keith also remembered his time at the academy, where the teachers were similar. However, the current situation at the academy was different, thanks to Cell's educational reforms. Keith informed Balak that he had heard stories about his enthusiastic teaching approach, and some students feared him due to his strictness. However, he didn't believe that any of them truly disliked his teaching method. Balak chuckled and hoped that it was true. He then mentioned having a class with one of Keith's students yesterday and couldn't help but wonder what he was doing with those kids. Keith wonders if there was some kind of issue with them, but he tells him that it was actually the opposite. Their eyes seemed different in some way. They had always been capable, but now they had even more passion and motivation, or maybe even a thirst for blood. It really surprised him. Keith understands what he means and assures him that he wasn't doing anything strange to them. He simply tried giving them a common goal to work towards. Since their subject was combat techniques, it was crucial in helping them achieve their goal. That's probably why he noticed the change in attitude. Balak asks what kind of common goal he gave them, and he explains that it was to win next month's competition. Balak is surprised and mentions that he had only heard of one time when a first class was able to win. Keith responds by saying that if it had been done in the past, there was no reason to believe they couldn't do it too. Balak agrees that it's definitely not a bad mindset, but considering how powerful Class 3C is, he believes their victory is guaranteed. K asks if he's talking about Luca Rivet, and BAC replies that from his perspective, that girl is undoubtedly a genius. She's not the only strong student in their class either. Luca Rivet is also a member of Class 3C and the top student in her year. Luca Rivet from Class 3C was widely known for her superior combat ability. She had even engaged in a mock battle with an active knight from the academy, which ended in a draw. However, she had dominated the battlefield throughout the entire fight. Her tactical thinking and leadership skills were exceptional, making her the main obstacle for Class W if they wanted to win the competition. Despite being on par with an active knight, Luca's opponents believed they had a fair chance at beating her since they still had a month to prepare. While Keith was in his research room, Akris entered and bombarded him with numerous questions. She asked about his sleep, diet, and adjustment to the new environment. Keith, being 20 years old, reminded her that he was 4 years younger than her but still her senior. He also noted that she hadn't changed at all since the old days and was just as disrespectful as ever. However, he did acknowledge that she seemed slightly more mature now compared to before. Playfully, she teased him and asked if his heart skipped a beat because of her. Keith confidently replied that he was already immune to that. Thanks to Celine, she laughs and tells him that he hasn't changed at all. He keeps bringing up Celine every chance he gets and questions her about what she wants from him. She casually mentions that it's nothing important, just her curiosity about one of his students, Elistera. She couldn't help but wonder why Elistera seemed so rushed. Keith admits that he doesn't know either, but she seems to have calmed down a bit now. At least she's convinced herself that there's no need to rush at the moment. Akris asks if it has something to do with her family, and he says he's already looked into it, but he's not completely sure. Elistera is the youngest child of the Grantis family, with 3 brothers and 3 sisters. All of her siblings are members of the First Knight Order, commanded by their father, Ed and Grantis. They've all shown excellent results. Akris understands that her path is already set for her, and he guesses that the expectations from her family must be weighing heavily on her. He says it's possible, but as an outsider observer, he has a hunch that Elistera is just scared. Akris agrees and says that's the impression she gets too, so she's inclined to believe it. But then he murmurs to himself that death is a scary thing. After all, he goes on to explain that even if that were true and she was genuinely scared, saying such things to a noble could have serious consequences, especially considering her family's high status. It could easily be seen as an insult. However, if Elistera's fear was simply about fighting, then it would benefit both him and her to address this issue early on. Akris starts to smile and mentions that she must really hold Elistera in high regard, since he wouldn't normally say something like, beneficial for me and her both. At the same time, Elistera thinks to herself that all that matters to him is a person's strength and accomplishments. She doesn't believe that she holds much value in his eyes, but she acknowledges that she shows promise and potential. So Akris says aloud that one day she might become an important person to him, feeling a twinge of jealousy. However, she quickly dismisses these thoughts and expresses her wish to have someone she could be useful to. Keith, confused, asks her what she means. He reassures her that having her by his side is absolutely essential to him. Akris blushes, and he adds that he wouldn't waste his time on someone he didn't care about. Akris agrees with him, so he gives her a heads up and tells her that she will be seeing his students often in the upcoming weeks. He asks her to take good care of them. Later that night, in the Clinker Fortress southwest of the capital in the western side of the Magnolia territory, Count furiously slams the desk and questions how many times he needs to repeat himself. The 11th Night Order requires soldiers and resources for their next large-scale operation. The person in front of him is Bronze Magnolia, the second son of the Lord of Magnolia and the supervisor of the Clinker Fortress. Bronze tells him that he must already be aware that they have seen little success in their battles with monsters lately. Considering the current situation, he couldn't find a single logical reason to proceed with his idea at this given time. They have already had a streak of deaths over the last few days, and this fortress is also housing many wounded knights at the moment. Therefore, suggesting a plan like his at a time when the knights' morale is already so low is quite risky. In fact, it could also be called reckless. Count yells, asking if he is trying to make a fool out of him. Bronze simply questions him if he does not care at all if this country falls into ruins. Even though they do support the knights, it doesn't mean they have to agree with all their requests. So they won't be following his proposal. He's speaking on behalf of the entire Magnolia family. He further explains that they've been successfully defending the frontline territories for the past year. If the situation had remained the same, he would have considered a counterattack to reclaim their stolen lands. However, it's currently impossible to entertain that idea. He tells the Count to be aware of this. Commander Benoit Bronze excuses himself, mentioning they still have wounded knights to take care of. He whispers to himself, wishing that Count hadn't gotten rid of Keith. The Count gets into his carriage, still agitated. He thinks that if Bronze is underestimating him, he'll prove them wrong once his strategy succeeds. They'll have to admit their mistakes, whether they like it or not. He vows to show them, believing that if his father could accomplish something like this, there's no reason why he can't. Meanwhile, back to Bronze, his servant asks if he meant Sage by Keith. He confirms and acknowledges that Keith was an exceptional knight. He knows that the nobles banished him from joining knight orders. Although he didn't really know the specifics, he could roughly imagine what must have happened regardless. Now that Keith could no longer assist them, their job was to hold off the monster's advances for as long as possible. The scene then shifted back to Class 1A, where it was time for another practical lesson. Keith explained that, as they had seen in the previous mock battle, coordination becomes more difficult with more people involved. Therefore, for today's lesson, they would all be fighting in groups of 3, as it was the smallest unit they would work in. Keith had already decided on the groupings, so he instructed them to step forward once he called their name. The teams were formed, but then Raoul voiced his concern, stating that it was unfair no matter how they looked at it. Keith asked if he was not satisfied with Elistera and Ymir, to which Raoul responded that they were too strong compared to everyone else. Keith then replied that if they were that confident, he wouldn't be giving their team any hints today, so they could show him what they were capable of. Raoul couldn't understand what he was thinking, but another student also pointed out that it seemed a bit too harsh. Lena, Silika, and Fairy were the 3 worst students in the entire class. To make matters worse, they were also put together as a team. With a serious expression, Silika asks Lena if it would make more sense for them to switch places, since both she and Raoul were fire specialisteras. Fairy chimes in, admitting that she couldn't properly use any of her attributes. However, the other 2 were surprised to see that she could actually use magic. Fairy explains that she could use physical magic, healing magic, and even a bit of water magic in battle. Lena, coming from a family of scouts, is asked by Fairy if she could use detection or something similar. Lena replies that she could use detection, sensory enhancement, and more, but all 3 of them doubted if any of that would actually help them in battle. Keith then informs them that they would be the first ones to fight that day, and their opponent would be Elistera's team. Feeling defeated, the 3 of them give up. Silika asks Keith if he just wanted to see them suffer, but he reassures them that all he wanted was for them to win. He believed that their victory would help change the perception of students who focused solely on their grades. Although they understood his intentions, Silika still believed that their plan was destined to fail. Keith explains that despite their opponents being top students in their class, they were all freshmen. However, the 3 of them somehow managed to get into the academy, which means they at least have the basics figured out. With the right strategy, Keith assures them that they should have a slight chance of winning. Elle then points out that they weren't even great as fighters, and Silika agrees, mentioning their weaknesses. Lena's magical power is weak, Lena's magical output is low, and Fair's offensive magic is almost non-existent. Furthermore, their sword skills are pretty bad. Keith understands where they're coming from, as the opposing team has a higher mana capacity, better conversion efficiency, and stronger spells. Additionally, the 3 of them can't compete with them in sword skills. However, Keith tells them that they don't need to play into their opponent's strengths. Instead, They just need to prevent them from utilizing their true potential and focus on maximizing the few skills they have. This motivates Celica and her team, as it sounds like the perfect fighting style for weaklings. Essentially, all they need to do is wear their opponents out. He gives them further instructions, saying that Lina should be in the front because she was the best at sensing and avoiding enemy attacks, ensuring her safety. Fairy should be at the rear, supporting her with healing and strengthening magic as needed. Lastly, Celica's job was to keep her distance and bombard the other team with spells, preventing them from casting their own magic. He suggests that they conserve their strength and disrupt the opponent's plans, as once they become impatient, they will likely charge at either Fairy or Celica with full force, since they are in the back. Celica is worried that they won't be able to defend against a full power charge from all three opponents. But Keith assures her that it's actually the perfect opportunity for them. He explains that when one of the opponents breaks formation and charges at them, they won't be paying attention to Lina, allowing the three of them to surround that person and attack together. Lina hesitantly asks if they can really pull it off, and he simply replies that it depends solely on the three of them. However, if he didn't believe they were capable, he wouldn't have instructed them to do it in the first place. Determined, the three of them decided to trust him, even as the other team observed them. Ymir was confident that their opponents wouldn't be able to close the gap in ability, but Raoul still had doubts. After all, the professor was on their side and likely had a plan. Despite their caution, they decided to observe their opponent's actions first before making a decision. Finally, it was time to begin the mock battle. Keith informed them that the fight would continue until one side couldn't go on or surrendered. With that, the match started and both sides charged at each other. In the midst of the chaos, Elistera recalled a lesson from one of their classes. In a team of three, there was a basic formation where the person in the front bought time for the person in the back to cast powerful spells, while the person in the middle protected the person in the back and assisted the one in the front. She noticed that they were using the same formation, but lacked powerful spells. If Raoul were to hit them with a strong spell, it would be game over. Therefore, Elistera believed that they had already won. Lina was engaged in a fight with Ymir, while Celica utilized her long-range magic spell to keep Raoul occupied. Elistera decided to target Fairy first, but just as she was about to attack, Lina unexpectedly intervened and stopped her. Elistera was taken aback to see Lina there, and Ymir apologized to her for underestimating her speed. Lina reassured him that it was all right and suggested they take out Fairy together. They both launched a simultaneous attack, but somehow Fairy managed to keep up with them and hold her ground. Ymir couldn't believe that she was able to parry both of them so skillfully, and they attacked her once again. Meanwhile, Graham questioned Keith if he had employed some kind of trick, but Keith dismissed the idea, stating that he wouldn't interfere in a match between his students. It was true that Lina's movements were unusually sharp at the moment, but that was only because her abilities had been enhanced with Fair's physical magic. Graham was still puzzled since the fairy aspect made sense, but Lina didn't possess any sword skills to begin with. Keith clarified that Lina was simply utilizing her detection and sense enhancement abilities. These skills allowed her to predict her opponent's moves, which she had always been doing. The difference now was that she could physically react to them, something she hadn't been able to do before. Thanks to Fairy's strengthening magic, Lina no longer had a problem. Now she was fully utilizing her abilities to see, but her inability to react remained her biggest weakness. So from now on, he decided to help her increase her output and learn how to use physical magic. With just these two skills, she would become a formidable fighter. Graham was amazed by her progress, but Keith pointed out that because Lina specialized in survival, she lacked defensive power to defeat Elistera and Ymir. Graham asked if Keith was implying that Elistera's team would still win the match, but that wasn't what he meant. Celica's barrage of fireballs was effectively keeping Raoul in check and wearing him out, as he struggled with weaker spells, just like Lina. Graham then questioned the purpose of knowing powerful spells if they were easy to interfere with. Keith responded that knowing powerful spells wasn't a bad thing, but it could be a weakness in a real battle if they were easily disrupted. Meanwhile, Celica continued her relentless attacks on Raoul, pushing him back. Keith further explained that they also had to deal with continuous attacks from monsters, which they might encounter on the front lines. However, all of their magical abilities required time to cast. This meant that they would become a burden to their team if they couldn't cast their spells quickly. On the other hand, people like Celica who could cast weaker spells in rapid succession were extremely effective against smaller monsters. In fact, they played a crucial role in preventing monster invasions. In other words, different people were valuable in different situations. Elistera then tells her team to ignore Lina, as her attacks were merely annoying and posed no real threat. Elistera instructs Raoul to provide cover from behind, while she and Ymir go after Celica. As they charged towards her, Celica began to retreat and they pursued her. This was their chance to take action. Fairy used her strengthening magic on Lina and swiftly dashed towards both of them from behind. Before Raoul could react, Elistera managed to block Fairy's attack. Celica's classmate Graham was impressed by Elistera's quick reflexes in stopping an attack from behind. However, Fairy intervened and slashed both Elistera and Raoul with her sword. Elistera and Ymir fell to the ground, and the three of them stood victorious. Raoul surrendered, leaving everyone shocked by the outcome. Keith instructed the winners to carry the unconscious participants to the sick bay while he moved on to the next match. Later in the sick bay, Akris shouts at him and asks what he did to send 10 students there at once. He tells her to calm down, since yelling wasn't allowed in the sick bay. She starts scolding him in a whisper, and he remembers how she used to grumble like this when they were students. Suddenly they hear something, and Elistera wakes up. He's impressed to see her recover quickly, even though her match was the first one today. While Akris checks up on her, he questions how it felt to be sent to the sick bay by the 3 worst students in her class. She asks if he's always this insensitive. He explains that it's because she fought in a disorganized manner, coming up with her own strategy and ordering others around during the match. Therefore, most of the blame for her loss lies with her alone. Akris tells him to be nicer, but he doesn't see why he should. He clarifies that he's not upset with her, but wants her to understand her responsibility, analyze the factors that led to her loss, and find a way to improve in the future. She's a bit relieved that he's not upset. Then she confesses that she understood why they lost today. They followed the formation taught to them in class, but that only trapped them in the wrong mindset. The Academy's teachings were meant for fighting monsters, not humans. Teeth agreed, realizing that using the wrong approach would only distance them from their goals. So he asks her for her thoughts on what they should have done instead. She starts mumbling that since humans were more fragile than small-sized monsters, there was no need to rely on Raoul's powerful magic to attack them. Instead, she suggests placing Raoul in the front and casting consecutive spells from behind. He agrees, saying that instead of blindly following what they were taught and risking failure, they should have taken the time to devise the best strategy for the situation. He asks if she was overly cautious before the battle because she thought he had a secret plan. She admits that she was, which is why she positioned herself in the middle of the formation, the most flexible spot. Keith tells her that maybe he did have a secret plan, but it relied on her reacting exactly as she did. Her anxiety stemmed from not knowing what he had planned, so she made a decision to rely on what she had been taught because it gave her some comfort. She believed that her weak mindset was the reason for her defeat. When she saw that her opponents were using the same formation as her team, she assumed it would be a battle of skill. However, she soon realized that the other team had a clear strategy with their formation, and she never even had a chance to showcase her skills. Elistera admits that the loss was her fault, but then someone tells her that all she needs to do is learn from this experience and do better next time. Admitting one's own mistakes is the first step towards improvement, and without making mistakes, humanity wouldn't be where it is today. Her eyes light up, and she promises to give her best. The person then informs her that the skills that work on humans may not necessarily work against monsters, so they won't affect her grades at the Night Academy. However, if she feels that those skills were of no use, she is free to disregard them. Yet, She replies that they can't do that if they want to secure the first place in next month's competition. This catches Acris's attention, as she didn't know they were planning for that. Elistera tells her that there was one instance before them where a first class won the competition. Acris excitedly wishes her all the best. While Keith reflects on the time, he suggested that goal. She was the first one to support it, and her words motivated everyone else. In the end, the whole class agreed to make it their goal. She truly had a talent for being a leader, which only made him more curious about the occasional weakness she displayed. Later, while he was in his research room, Celica, Fairy, and Lina knock on his door and say they wanted to talk to him. They all sit down, and since all three of them were together, he figures it must be about the mock battle. So he asks them how he could help. Celica starts off by thanking him and tells him that despite her grades, she had always wanted to be a knight. She tried really hard to get into this academy, but once she actually made it here, she saw how incredible everyone around her was. Lately, she had been feeling like she didn't deserve to be here. She was convinced that the three of them had no chance of winning against those three. So, when they actually won, she couldn't believe it at first, but soon enough, she felt incredibly happy. She was unable to put it into words, but it was like she had finally found peace of mind. Fairy and Lina played a role in that too. However, he was the one who provided them with this opportunity, and she was grateful for that. Keith simply responds with an approving nod, surprising all three of them with his plain reaction. He acknowledges that they all performed exceptionally well today and wants to commend them. However, he also emphasizes that he doesn't want them to become complacent with this victory alone. Lina asks if he means they should keep winning, and he agrees. However, due to his position, he can't solely prioritize one group of students. He wants all of his students to improve by competing against each other. For jokes around and suggests that he just wants to take it easy. In response, Keith smirks and playfully asks if that's how he appears to her, like a slacker, making her nervous. They all share a laugh. Lina admits that she initially found him intimidating, but he turned out to be the complete opposite, always smiling and cracking jokes. They are genuinely glad about that. Keith refocuses the conversation and reminds them that while they have the right to celebrate their victory, they should also be aware that it doesn't mean they have become stronger. If they were to face the same opponents again, they shouldn't fall for the same trick twice. Celica mentions that they understand, and that was actually the other thing they wanted to say. The three of them are determined to become stronger, and Keith is happy that they have the motivation to improve. However, Keith has already given them a study plan, so they are not sure what else they can do. Fairy interjects and says that the study plan was given to all students, but as the worst three, they want to do more than the rest to catch up. Lina adds that they don't want to hold everyone back during the tournament. Keith understands their urgency and decides to make an exception. He asks them to wait for him at the training grounds, as he will provide them with special guidance. The three of them get excited, but Keith warns them that they were the ones who asked for it, so they should prepare themselves. This makes the three of them scared once again. The scene then shifts to Celine, who came to see Prince Alan. He is delighted to see her after such a long time. They usually communicate through letters, so it's nice to finally meet in person. First of all, Celine thanks him for sending Keith to the academy. Prince Alan tells her that there was no need, he simply thought she was one of the few people who could handle him. However, she pondered if it was the right choice. The front lines couldn't afford to lose someone as strong as Keith. Alan mentioned that Keith wasn't suitable for an order because he lacked trust in people and didn't cooperate. Additionally, he lacked leadership skills. In the end, Keith even went as far as punching a commander. While Keith could defeat enemies in front of him, these victories would only be temporary. No matter how well he performed on the front lines, it was pointless if they couldn't hold their own without him. Their long-term goal was to reclaim the stolen lands from the monsters. To achieve this, Keith needed to teach the next generation. Celine understood Alan's point and agreed that she enjoyed thinking deeply. Alan believed he was good at teaching, which is why she wanted him to be involved. Celine remembered how he used to teach Alan when they were students, but they avoided discussing that topic. Alan admitted that it was his fault they couldn't fully utilize Keith's potential. He didn't think his efforts alone would be enough, so he asked his senpai to also take care of Keith. Celine lets out a sigh and explains to him that she didn't really have the power to control him. However, she admits that she is one of the few people he can trust. He wasn't asking for much, just her support as a teacher. Celine assures him that she was going to support him anyway, but then she asks why they were hiding the fact that Keith was a sage. Alan clarifies that there was no specific reason, he just didn't want his students to blindly follow him because of his status. He wanted them to respect him for his teachings. Celine understands and agrees to let it slide, acknowledging that Alan respects Keith the most. However, Alan clarifies that he only respects Keith's talent and finds his personality awful. He won't deny that. The scene then shifts back to Celica and her group, where Keith stomps on Fairy's hand and asks if she's done. Earlier they had gathered in the training ground, and Keith informed them that he would be imposing restrictions. Celica and Lena were using magic to move, while the three of them had to work together to escape. Without even giving them a chance to ask anything, he immediately restricts both Lena and Celica's movements. They couldn't move at all now, so he asks them how they plan to proceed. Celica tries to tell him that she needs to attack, but before she can finish, he takes away her voice as well. He can also move them around, so that's something they need to consider. Fairy starts using her strengthening magic, surprising him because she intends to take him on alone. She didn't have that kind of courage a week ago. She draws her sword and says that she's not completely useless either. He agrees, acknowledging that there isn't much difference in skills within their class. However, what she's doing is still too reckless. He quickly closes in on her and knocks her back with a simple tackle. Celica and Lena are stunned to see how easily she was sent flying. He explains that he used her center of gravity against her. As she tries to retrieve her sword, he stomps on her hand and tells her that she's full of openings. She screams in pain. Even though the training grounds prevent them from suffering physical damage, the pain is still unbearable. He removes his feet and inquires if she had finished already. He informs her that if she surrenders so pathetically, without even attempting to buy time for the others to escape, she won't succeed. He points out that she was the only one capable of moving, so she should have attacked. She argues that both of his hands were occupied, but he approaches her sword and reveals that she still hasn't realized who she was up against. He could use both of his hands perfectly fine, as he picks up the sword. All three of them are astonished, and he explains that clenching his fist was just part of the activation process, not necessary to sustain the magic. She questions why he kept his hands closed, and he responds that he assumed she would make false assumptions, as she seemed like the type to jump to conclusions. What she should have done was be more observant and carefully plan her attacks. As a consequence for her failure, he tosses her sword and instructs her to sprint and retrieve it. She admits that she's terrible at sprinting, to which he asks why she even has the strengthening magic. Afterwards, he returns to Celica and Lena and suggests that they should have also tried to take action. He reminds them that Elistera managed to escape on her own, which annoys them even more because he still hadn't given them their voices back. Despite that, he provides them with the guidance they were seeking, leaving it up to them to decide if they wanted to feel confident and have high hopes for the future. However, he also reminds them not to forget that this was still their current reality, which frustrates all three of them. Later, while in the shower, Fairy is still angry at him for playing around and making her run so much. Lena acknowledges that what he said was true. Celica then expresses her surprise at learning about monsters with invisible powers that can hold someone down, mentioning something called Mirage Hand. Fairy points out that it's strange because monster abilities are different from magic, so humans shouldn't be able to use them. Celica agrees, finding it all very peculiar. After mentioning it, she wonders about his mana attribute. Lena mentions that he hadn't told them yet, which was strange considering how strong he was. They all wondered why he was demoted. Lena sarcastically suggests that maybe he punched a commander, and they all laugh it off. Meanwhile, while Celine was still with Alan, he tells her to make sure to inform Keith as soon as she sees him that Sage Brandon had an edict waiting for him.